With that, thank you everyone for your patience, truly appreciate it, and we're going to get right into it. And the first question I have actually is for Hayden. Enteric methane has historically received less investment attention than other climate targets. What's driving the current momentum, and what do you think is holding us back?
So I think at a political level, we can't underestimate the importance of the Global Methane Pledge a few years ago. I mean, there will be critics of it and so on, but it's catalytic to have such a thing, a statement like that, endorsed by, at the time it was launched, more than 100 governments, and now I think more than 150. So the implementation and the action follows, and that's the challenge. But setting that signal that we have to focus on methane more than we have in the past, that has been very catalytic, and that's why I'm here. That mobilised the philanthropic funders that I mentioned. That's a big part of it, I think. And it's enabled us to be catalytic with the resources and the type of resources that philanthropy provide. The complexity that you described, Richard and Juan, we don't have that. Right? And the way we operate, it's maybe a bit more agile. We're not looking for return on investment in the same way you are. We want return, we want impact, but it's different. And I think that's really essential that we have these different models that can be active in this space. The last part of your question, specifically what areas of research, I think, I mean, grazing systems still are the challenge, and they are the 80% or more of enteric methane globally. We have to try and, well, we are, but we have to, all of us, try to think more about how do we get technologies into those systems, and maybe just to emphasise for us how important what we call our win-wins are as a means to begin that process. You know, the optimisation of feeding, grazing, health. If we don't do that first, we're not going to achieve reductions of methane in those systems ever, probably. And it's not to underestimate the challenge of getting progress in those areas either. I mean, we heard yesterday, was it 15% of the farmers surveyed don't have a cow and calf and beef systems in the United States. I hear statistics in Latin America, Juan, maybe correct me, of 60 to 70% weaning rates for decades. Impossible to, it seems, to improve that. So it's a real hard nut to crack, but without that, I think we're going to struggle. So much more focus on the grazing system and the tools we need.
Thank you. And for either, whether it be public-private investment or just investment, how do you evaluate whether an enteric methane mitigation solution is investment ready, particularly in terms of efficacy, scalability, and producer adoption? Sure.
Whether it's investment ready, that's a good question, because we've seen over 200 different organisations, research organisations or ventures and startups come to us and have solutions. How do we know they're investment ready? Sometimes we can play a part in helping them become investment ready. But often it's, are they actually focused on a solution, or are they continuing to do more research? So are they product and solutions focused? Are they focused on the agriculture sector, and do they understand it? Are they committed and open to going through the regulatory process? Do they understand what that involves? Sometimes there's education we can do to help them on that. But yeah, investable, it's really having a plan and some milestones to progress through that plan to get to a product and to get to market and start making an impact is what we're looking for.
Thank you. And now I have a question for Rich and Hayden. How are you thinking about balancing short-term emissions reductions, and Hayden, you mentioned a little bit of this previously, with long-term transformation, especially when it comes to supporting producer livelihoods? And this could be technologies as well, and it might not just be emissions reductions technology, including measurement, for instance.
One of the things that we're going to be doing, one of our outputs is going to be, a pathways to net zero program, document, manual, essentially, for farmers. We will be involved in facilitating industry-led efforts to set net zero targets. At the moment, the National Farmers Federation in Australia has a net zero by 2050 target. that's it. That's about as much as we've got as an agricultural-wide approach to net zero targets. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on that now to do more with the return of the government that we've just had in Australia. There's going to be, I think, a pretty stable period of policy around climate ambition now, and that will enhance or increase the amount of pressure on quicker targets and deeper cuts. We'll have a role in doing that in terms of our organisation. And that pathway to 2035 and 2050, getting back to the point of your question, balancing short-term, long-term, we need to show how cuts can be achieved quickly to meet 2035 targets, but then how we keep pushing and how we do longer-term cuts over time as well to get ultimately to net zero, if that's achievable from the ag sector, by 2050.
Our aspiration as an ag program is to help support achieving basically a halving of agricultural methane by 2050. We will not get there with technology alone, and we will not get there without doing the productivity work first, as I've mentioned. So for us, that equity piece and the short term and the medium to longer term is optimizing production systems, making the connection between the things I've mentioned, health, feeding and grazing management, to name three important ones. You could add heat tolerance, heat stress in there as well. Nothing new there, but the challenge we have is making that, counting the impact of those interventions and the relevance to methane reduction. And it comes back to the data that has been mentioned a lot. And how does a country wishing to make a contribution towards this agenda, to be fair, focus on those things that they should focus on first, which will be in their economic interest, likely to underpin nutritional security, probably have a strong link to resilience, but enable them to then monetize, for lack of a better word, those efforts in the carbon or in the climate world, which may be climate finance, it may be carbon markets. I think that's important. And the other thing we believe or know is doing that even widely is not going to be enough to get halving of methane by 2050. So it's preparing the sector, optimizing the sector to the extent possible so that it can be in a position to absorb these technologies we're hoping to develop, like the vaccines and the additives and the low methane forages and the genetics. That's our vision and approach, and we feel that's equitable, and it's thinking of the short term that is available, which doesn't require technology development. It requires extension, knowledge, capacity, etc. And then that runway towards the technologies, hopefully in the next, 3 to 5 years? 5 to 7 years? Yeah.
And I have one last question for Juan. In terms of public-private partnership, you mentioned the fuzzy line, and also Hayden, you mentioned trying to be catalytic when working with private companies. So the question is, to what extent should public-private investment de-risk early stage methane mitigation technologies versus, say, something like supporting infrastructure so that more people can have access to do more work?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Charles. I think it's critical. I mean, it's very difficult because if you are trying to identify some options that you want to have, as a competitive advantage, there's some of that early work that you have to do a bit on your own, right? But once there are some initial elements already there, there's a large chunk that I think could be brought into a shared space, that becomes pretty competitive. It is extremely difficult in my experience to convince private industry to provide funding for capacity building, because the answer is always, what's the ROI? Well, you're going to have the ability to test your product. Well, I don't pay overhead. It's the answer, right? It's visualized as overhead, And so that's my perspective from what I've experienced so far. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize we're at time. I'd love to take some questions from the audience, but I know the next panelist is probably ready to throttle me too. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists. If everyone can give them a round of applause.